So question 2, we are given a complex number z and we want to use de Moivre's theorem to raise this complex number to the fourth power. So we have z is equal to negative root 3 plus I. So if we just draw a quick sketch over here, this first term is on the x-axis and it's negative, so we have negative root 3 over here. I is on the y-axis and it must have a value of 1. So the point z lies out here. And if we join that to the origin, we can get this angle alpha. So tan of alpha then, given that this value here is 1, must be equal to over the square root of 3. And that is equal to 30 degrees. And if we put that into radians, that is equal to pi over 6. So, sorry, I should say alpha then is pi over 6. The angle we wish to find is this angle theta. Theta then must be equal to pi minus pi over 6. That is equal to 5 pi over 6. And the reason we are doing this, of course, is to write this complex number in terms of sine and cosine. So the final thing we need is the modulus of z, and that is equal to the square root of negative root 3 to be squared plus 1 to be squared. That is equal to the square root of 4, which is equal to 2. So we can say now that z is equal to 2 times the cosine of 5 pi over 6 plus I sine 5 pi over 6. And we wish to raise z to the fourth power. So if I just put 4 here, and that is equal to 2, 4, 8, 16 times the cosine of 20 pi over 6 plus I sine 20 pi over 6 pi radians. And if we simplify that down, that is equal to 16 times the cosine of 8 pi over 6 plus I sine of the same. Okay, so we can say then that that is equal to 16 times the cosine of 8 pi over 6 is the same as the cosine of 4 pi over 3. So the cosine of 8 pi over 6 is minus a half plus I sine 8 pi over 6, which is minus the square root of 3 over 2 times I, and that gives us minus 8 times the square root of 3 times I, and that is z to the 4 in the form we were looking for. So this is our answer. So part B, we have the complex number w is such that the modulus of w is 3 and it makes an angle of 30 degrees with the real axes. Okay, so if we just draw a rough sketch, and we know there's an angle here of 30 degrees. If we make this point here w, we know the distance from the origin is 3, so we can write w straight away in terms of sine and cosine, and we'd say w is equal to 3 times cosine 30 degrees is pi over 6 radians plus I sine of the same. And what we want to do is, if t is equal to z times w, write t in its simplest form. Okay, so we need z, and we found z to be 2 times the cosine of 5 pi over 6 plus I sine 5 pi over 6. So we had 2 times the cosine 5 pi over 6 radians plus I sine of the same. And we want to find t, which is equal to zw. So we just multiply these, and that will give us zw is equal to 6 times. And we'll start with cosine 5 pi over 6. Cosine pi over 6 plus cosine 5 pi over 6 I sine 5 pi over 6 plus I sine 5 pi over 6 cosine pi over 6 plus I sine 5 pi over 6 I sine pi over 6. Okay, so we're going to tidy this up a little bit. We can rewrite that as 6 outside of cosine 5 pi over 6 cosine pi over 6 So this I here and this I here aren't going to go anywhere. These two i's multiplied together give us a -1. So we get minus sine 5 pi over 6 sine pi over 6 plus we have cosine 5 pi over 6 I sine 5 pi over 6 No, that's not correct. That should be a pi over 6, sorry. So we have cosine, that's correct. Then we have sine, that's correct. Okay, so I think that was the mistake. And then we will have this term here. So we will have plus I sine 5 pi over 6 cosine pi over 6. Okay, if you look in your mathematical tables, for cosine A, cosine B, minus sine A, sine B, you will see there is a formula. And that formula is that this is equal to cosine A plus B. So we have the cosine of 5 pi over 6 plus pi over 6. And you will also find a formula for cosine A, sine B, sine A, cosine B. And that is equal to the sine of A plus B and that gives us that we have 6 outside of the cosine of 6 pi over 6 plus I sine of the same. We cancel out the 6's and then that gives us, we have 6 times the cosine of pi is -1 plus I times the sine of pi is 0 and our answer is -6. Okay, so we're saying t in its simplest form is -6. And that is the end of question 2.